AP US History Video 28, The Constitution in Practice and Policy Issues in the New United States. I'm John Linneball. I'm with John Linneball Tutoring, and this is my video channel. If you like this video, don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. The Constitution in Practice. The first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, were the first people to take action based on the Constitution, that is, to put it into practice and make it more than a mere document. After all, laws are just nice words on pieces of paper until someone actually enforces them. The Constitution created a judiciary and the Supreme Court, but it did not specify how the rest of the judicial system should be. Thus, the Judiciary Act of 1789 was passed by Congress in order to lay that out. The act created a federal district court in each state and 3 district courts that were courts of appeals, from which each federal district appeals could be heard. Each federal district court's cases could be appealed from there, is what I'm trying to say. The Supreme Court would then handle any appeals from the courts of appeals or state court rulings that interpreted federal law. So it's evolved over the years to 12 U.S. courts of appeals that handle appeals from 91 U.S. district courts. Most common way that cases end up in the federal system is in district court. There are specialized courts like the military courts, U.S. tax courts, federal regulatory agencies, the U.S. Court for the District of Columbia, and then you have the U.S. Court of International Trade, Claims Court. These are specialized courts that end up at the Federal Circuit, and the military courts go to the Court of Military Appeals. So there's 12 U.S. Courts of Appeal, plus the Federal Circuit, plus the U.S. Court of Military Appeals, 14 ways to get to 14 lower appellate courts that sit below the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court actually has to issue a writ of certiorari in order for something to be appealed to it. So what that means in plain English, the U.S. Supreme Court gets to pick and choose what appeals from these lower appellate courts it actually hears. And it can also hear anything that comes from a state court. So we could draw in here state court, state appellate court, state Supreme Court, and then boom, U.S. Supreme Court, if there is an actual issue of federal law. The way that a state court can keep things out of federal court is just write the decisions so they're based exclusively on state law. Then the U.S. Supreme Court has no jurisdiction. George Washington starts the unwritten Constitution. Washington established several customs that are now called the Unwritten Constitution. For example, the establishment of a cabinet, the Secretary of State, etc. Those are things that are not in the Constitution, but it's just been recognized because it's been done since literally the first president, Washington. Here we see former President Obama, when he was president, with his cabinet. And here we see Secretary of State Clinton, etc., etc. The first cabinet involves 3 people because there were only 3 cabinet positions, 3 sub-departments of the executive branch. So we had the State Department, which was headed by Thomas Jefferson, the Department of War, headed by General Henry Knox, and the Treasury Department, headed by Alexander Hamilton. Washington met with these men regularly, seeking their input on important decisions because he trusted their judgment. George Washington started the Unwritten Constitution, as I just said, and another way in which he did it was he decided to run for no more than 2 terms, so that became kind of part of the Unwritten Constitution until the 22nd Amendment, when it became part of the Written Constitution, and presidents were officially limited to 2 terms. FDR was elected to 4 terms as president. He died in the middle of his 4th term while World War II was still going on. And as we can see here, let's have Bernie say it. "The last time America had a democratic socialist, they had to enact term limits because he kept getting reelected over and over and over again. I'm again asking you to elect me, a democratic socialist." All right, that's enough out of you, Bernie. No, I'm kidding. Bernie is awesome. Sorry for the world's worst Bernie impression, but I just wanted to do it. So anyway, let's move on. Policy issues in the new United States. Several political issues arose during the administrations of the first two presidents, Washington and John Adams. They were about foreign policy, economic policy, and federal state relations. The Federalists and the Republicans were the first two political parties. Don't mistake the Republicans of the early 1800s for the Republicans of the 2020s or really the last 50 years or so. Basically, the Republicans of then would be more like the Democrats of today, sort of. Anyway, Federalists and Republicans. They were the first two political parties. They differed greatly on public policy, but of course, since you had two people who disagreed with each other, or two groups of people, I should say, that enabled a national debate on these issues. So the Federalists were pro-British, generally critical of the French Revolution, and pro-urban commercial interests, and they were very eager to use federal power to influence the economy. Hamilton was a main Federalist theorist. The Republicans were anti-British, supported the early French Revolution. The French Revolution kind of devolved into something that nobody could really support. And they were anti-central, that is, federal authority, and pro-agrarian, so they're pro-farmer. Thomas Jefferson was a chief Republican theorist. Hamilton's economic program. Well, the first step was, he said, let's print a bunch of $10 bills with my picture on it. I'm kidding. Hamilton responded to the need to stabilize the national economy, which has always been a national priority. I defy you to find any presidential administration where one of the first priorities was not to stabilize the economy and avert some sort of impending crisis. The National Bank was the first step taken here by Alexander Hamilton, and the idea it would hold tax revenues and stabilize the economy. Hamilton proposed 20% public ownership and 80% private ownership of the bank. The idea was to have wealthy investors literally and figuratively invested in the bank. That is, they'd actually put money in the bank, so they would literally invest in it, and they would think it was a good idea, so then they'd be figuratively invested in the idea of the bank's survival and being able to thrive and help the country. Interpreting the Constitution. This is one of the earliest cases where the Constitution had to be interpreted. Thomas Jefferson argued that the Constitution didn't allow for a national bank since it wasn't brought up in the Constitution anywhere, but Hamilton countered that the necessary and proper, or the elastic clause as it's sometimes called, allowed for it. Washington agreed with Hamilton and signed the law that enabled the bank to come into existence in 1791. Thus, the loose interpretation versus the strict interpretation of the Constitution debate, which rages to this day, was born. I'm a little bit cynical about this. Basically, the idea is people will support the loose interpretation when they want something that isn't specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And then they'll want the strict interpretation when something they don't like is not something that's really strictly backed by the Constitution or in the Constitution. So you'll have politicians speaking out of both sides of their mouth depending on what helps them. Oh well, what else is new? Encouraging manufacturing. If a country can't make necessary things, it must import them. That can lead to real problems. Think of the current COVID crisis. There's a problem with masks and medicines and a lot of things that are made in foreign countries that used to be made in the United States. Then we wonder why we have an unemployment problem and are too dependent on other countries. As I've seen on stickers and things like that, if you can't live without me, I own you. It's a common slogan, and yeah, if you need goods that are manufactured in other countries, well, then your country is dependent on those other countries. That's a big problem. So Alexander Hamilton's financial program encouraged manufacturing, but the country wasn't quite ready to develop much industry at that time. The War of 1812 would later drive home the importance of domestic manufacturing, probably because when you're at war and you have a foreign navy blockading your ports, then you're going to have a big problem if there's something you need and you can't get. All right. Excise tax and the 1791 to 1794 Whiskey Rebellion. Congress passed a tax on whiskey in 1791, intensifying conflicts between Western Pennsylvania farmers and the elite. While alcohol taxes were common ways to fund the government in Europe, poor farmers who relied on whiskey sales to make money felt they were being unfairly singled out. For example, large distillers could pay a flat fee, which worked out to about 6 cents a gallon in general. Small distillers had to pay by the gallon, and that was 9 cents a gallon, so large distillers were generally paying 3 cents less a gallon, and 3 cents was a lot of money back in those days. So, whiskey was easier and much more profitable to transport over the bad roads and sell than grain or beer. beer had more water in it, so that's heavier and harder to carry, less bang for the buck, so to speak. And grain, of course, is big and heavy and bulky, and you'd have to take it to probably some mill so it could be processed into flour that people would buy, whereas people would be happy to buy a jug of whiskey directly from you off your wagon. So also, some people were paid in whiskey. It was a medium of exchange in a lot of places where actual cash was scarce. So this effectively worked as an income tax. The idea is these people would be paid in whiskey and have to trade it. But then if the people who were paying them in whiskey had to pay the government money, that was an income tax. So it was a problem. The Whiskey Rebellion flag represented the 13 states. So we can see the stars that represent the 13 states. The eagle was America. It's still used today by some tax protest groups. 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion gets violent. While there was a rebellion starting in 1791 against the whiskey tax, it was peaceful. It was just people having conventions and speaking out against it and lobbying against it. But it didn't become an actual armed violent rebellion until 1794. And it started in western Pennsylvania when 50 farmers marched on the home of the local tax collector. This turned into a march of 7,000 farmers on Pittsburgh. Washington and others who recalled Shays' rebellion in western Massachusetts from about a decade before quickly and personally led 13,000 troops to Pennsylvania to quell the rebellion. This was his way of saying no to an unlawful rebellion.
I am a cop, and you will respect my authority.
Respect my authority! There's a fine line between respect and fear. Basically, Washington was just saying, hey, you don't have to respect the law, but then you better be afraid of the people I'm going to send in for law enforcement if you don't respect my law. So I expect you to obey whether or not you agree with it. And there are important principles behind it. Generally, it's a bad idea to negotiate with people who use violence as a tactic. For example, the common statement, we don't negotiate with terrorists. But this rule is occasionally violated. You may have no choice. For example, if somebody's in a position to cause a lot more damage than you can fix, you may actually have to negotiate with them until such a time that you can get them out of the situation where they can actually hurt you. But I digress. In this case, again, Washington had to stop the rebellion if he wanted any federal law to be taken seriously, because otherwise everyone would just say, oh, that's okay. We'll just go march on the tax collector's house and then they won't collect the tax. Washington said, yeah, that's not the way it works, guys. The controversial Alien and Sedition Acts. Federalist and Republican rivalries led to a Federalist-dominated Congress to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts to criminalize criticism from the Republican Party. The acts were actually 4 acts. The Naturalization Act was designed to make it harder for immigrants to become citizens, presumably because most immigrants would vote Republican or Democratic Republican, whatever you want to call it. So the time that you had to live in the United States to become a citizen went from 5 years to 14 years. The Sedition Act made it a crime to defame the president or Congress, which itself violated the First Amendment. Can you even imagine if you could go to prison for criticizing the president or criticizing Congress? Even in a defamatory way, generally, all that's going to happen today is somebody's going to call you a lying idiot. But under those laws, you could actually go to jail for that. If you want more information on this, go to the Alien and Sedition Acts Wikipedia entry for a description of these acts. But we're going to continue a little bit further here. The other 2 acts were the Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act. They allowed the president to imprison and deport aliens, that is, non-citizens, I'm not talking about E.T., the extraterrestrial, found in the United States. The Friends Act allowed the president to deport or imprison any alien he believed to be dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States at any time. That's you can find in Wikipedia. The Enemies Act allowed the president during wartime to imprison or deport any male citizen, that would be any male age 14 or older of an enemy nation when we're at war with that nation. The Republicans, also known as the Democratic Republicans, as I said before, such as Thomas Jefferson, were shocked at this huge expansion of federal power that would certainly not be abused in any way, Please note the sarcasm. Of course, that's what they're afraid of is, gee, whoever's president is going to say, oh, okay, well, I think you libeled me, so I'm going to put you in prison. Oh, you're a dangerous alien, so I'm going to send you back to your own country, or I'm going to put you in prison. It's certainly not because you oppose my politics, it's because you're a dangerous alien. So you can see how those laws could easily be abused. Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Jefferson in the 1798 resolution in Kentucky, and an unknown author who apparently wasn't Jefferson, or at least they don't know, in the 1799 Kentucky resolution said states can nullify illegal federal actions, that is, just rule them unenforceable. A phrase is null and void. Null and void means something is without legal force or effect. And then Madison and the Virginia resolution basically expressed the same idea as the Kentucky resolution. So you can see the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions at Wikipedia, just saying that if the federal government violates the Constitution, violates its own laws, etc., passes a law that it doesn't have the power to under the Constitution, then the states don't have to obey that law. So this is an issue of state versus federal power. A lot of times it's called states' rights. While the issue of what powers states and what powers the feds have were greatly settled by the Civil War, there are still disputes over the rights to these days. So yes, by what powers states and what powers the feds. I didn't put have there, but anyway, I don't mean what their power plants are, how they have their electrical power. I mean what powers they have, what can they do. And here we have the history of nullification. You might notice that nullification in the title is misspelled. There should be another L there. I didn't make this, but I thought it was a pretty good graphic, and I couldn't find another one with nullification spelled correctly. Anyway, but the Alien and Sedition Acts. When John Adams violated the Bill of Rights, banning speech critical of his government, Jefferson and Madison wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions showing that state and local governments could nullify any federal violation of the U.S. Constitution and any action not authorized by that document. And so Adams was discredited, the illegal censorship overturned, his career and his party destroyed. Nullification protected freedom of expression in the U.S., at least for the time being. So that's pretty important, to always stand up for things that are in the Constitution and don't let even the federal government violate things that you know are in the Constitution and are important rights. Disputes over slavery. So the North was in the midst of switching over to paid labor. Vermont was an early adopter. Again, Bernie. Vermont banned slavery in 1777, so Bernie was a teenager then. I'm kidding, okay. Anyway, it was 14 years before it became a state. Pennsylvania passed a gradual emancipation law in 1780, meaning children of slaves would be free, often after serving a certain number of years as slaves. The idea was to respect the property rights ideas of the time, so these people who were slave owners would not be deprived of their precious property rights, because that matters so much more than someone's actual right to be free. But oh well, that's the way they looked at it then. Okay, it's hard to look at it from today's perspective and say, okay, that was just rotten, and no, these slaves should just have been set free right away. But they weren't in Pennsylvania. Anyway, the idea was to respect the property rights, and free black communities sprang up in the North, as well as Virginia and Maryland in the South. In the South and adjacent Western territories, there was increasing slavery. Why? Because agricultural labor, especially the agricultural labor of that time, did best, and still does best, with low pay or no pay labor. So Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin made slavery much more attractive, since it made it much easier to remove the seeds from cotton, and thus it made sense to grow much more cotton, because cotton could be processed at a much higher rate, and thus they needed more people to do all the rest of the things you have to do to process cotton into thread and fabric, etc. So the number of slaves in the U.S. increased from 500,000 in the whole country in 1770 to 700,000 in 1790, even after Northern emancipation, escaped slaves, etc. Did you find this video useful? If you did, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Neither one costs you anything. you will be alerted about my new videos. Why? Well, it's simple. YouTube doesn't share any ad revenue unless I have 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 hours, which is 240,000 minutes of view time in a year. While many people are watching these videos, I don't have 4,000 hours of watch time. I also don't have 1,000 subscribers at this time. Ad money will help me make more videos, so that helps you, so you can help me help you. The same reasons I gave for you are basically reasons why you are encouraged to share links to this video, put it in playlists, etc. I gladly read and respond to constructive criticism or suggestions for new videos.
I'd appreciate your input.
I do reserve the right to delete comments such as troll posts or spam. You can hire me for tutoring if you are in the San Francisco Bay Area, subject to social distancing, masks, etc. I can meet with you in person. If you want to meet by video, obviously I can meet you by video from anywhere in the world. Thanks for watching, and there's a couple more things you can see right after this. Here's how to contact me. Facebook, you can go to facebook.com/Linnebaugh Tutoring. Instagram, instagram.com/John.Linnebaugh.tutoring. Phone, 415-623-4251. That's my cell phone, so you can call or you can text. Email, john@johnlinnebaugh.com. Website, www.johnlinnebaugh.com or johnlinnebaughtutoring.com. Both take you to my website. Testpreparation.locals.com. This has no ads on it as far as I know. And then there's lbry.tv, which I believe also does not have ads. And those are cool ways to see these videos without having to put up with things that you might have to put up with on other platforms. Mail, John Linnebaugh Tutoring, and it's 1859 Powell Street, number 109, San Francisco, California, 94133. And finally, note, this is not a substitute for your classes, text, etc. This video is based on the Barron's AP U.S. History Review Book, any other sources listed in the video description, and my general knowledge of U.S. history. While this should help you do well on the AP U.S. History exam, I can't be responsible for what your teacher thinks is important and asks you about on his or her own tests, homework, etc. So please read your class texts and pay attention to what your teacher says in class. And with that, I'm out. Have a good day.